Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center, and I'm thrilled to be with you guys today. This is the third week in which we are reading Hannah Arendt's early book, Rahel Varnhagen. It's a book that, as we've talked about, she wrote early in her life as a habilitation, second dissertation, and then luckily was saved by Gershom Scholem and was able to rework it and publish it later in her life. Last week we read the second chapter, Into the World. And I think it's just important for us to take a little bit of understanding of the arch of the book. The first one is the Jewish and the Shlemiel, which is really about how Rahel, as a Shlemiel, as someone who is constantly failing in the world, turns to introspection, to thinking, as a way to free herself from the world. I mean, and we talked a little bit about this 2 meetings ago, and it's going to come up again today. But so I just want us to have this in the mind that the person who is oppressed by the world, the person for whom the world as a reality, a Jew in this case, but anyone for whom the world is unbearable and is cruel, can turn away from the world, can rebel against the world, and find solace in a world of their own making, a subjective world, an introspective world. And this is the romantic turn. But it's also important to see that this is a turn that carries through all of Arendt's work into her book, Origins of Totalitarianism, which we've read together, in which she is arguing that one of the core foundations of totalitarianism is an incredible loneliness in society, which makes reality unbearable for the masses of people, both low class and upper class, but they all lose their class identities because they feel alone and abandoned by the world and oppressed by the world. And they seek to join and belong to and find meaning in mass movements. It's also apparent in her later writings in The Human Condition, where she talks about how the alienation from the world through the rise of science, which teaches us to distrust the common world because there's not the way we commonly understand things, the sun moving around the earth instead of the earth moving around the sun, or a bent stick in the water is not really bent. Science teaches us to distrust our common sense. And we therefore begin to distrust the world. And the response is not a fight to the world, but into ourselves, into the Cartesian self, into introspection, into that kind of subjectivist philosophy. And so this flight from the world and the danger of the flight from the world is actually one of the really overarching themes of all of Arendt's work. And it's deeply, deeply foregrounded. It is a thesis in many ways of her book on Rahel Varnhagen. The second chapter is called Into the World, and in a way it should be the remedy for the worldlessness of her being a Jew, her being a Shlemiel, her being someone for whom the world is dark and dangerous. And yet, as we all know, her relationship with Wittgenstein falls apart. But even before it fully falls apart, Arendt's discussion in the second part of this chapter, Into the World, is called Through Love. And I want to come back to a short passage we talked about briefly in this chapter on where she says, it's near the end of the chapter. It's on the second to last page or the third to last page of chapter 2, where she says, if one merely accepts fate, if one does not act at all, one attains a security which enables one to offer the same passive resistance to all misfortune. When Rahel tries to act, she would find she had no starting point from which she could meaningfully begin. She could not do anything specifically individual, but since Wittgenstein's love had made her a specific person without a specific world and without specific patterns, outlined only by love, since she had entered upon the adventure of particularity without having been taken in by any particular society, the sole stake she could offer for any action was her own self. When fate did not accept her sacrifice, when she became aware that she could not succeed in converting her lover into a specific person, after having first deprived him of his support, stripped him of his social being, she was thrown back into the despair and hopelessness out of which she had come. And we talked about this in the last session. I said that there's a way in which love and their love opened no world for Rahel. It left her without a specific personality, without specific patterns. It was a love, but it was a love based on nothing, a kind of empty love. And Jerry Cohn and I talked about it after the session, and he pointed me towards a passage in The Human Condition on page 242 of The Human Condition that is worth our paying attention to, where Arendt writes in The Human Condition, for love, although it is one of the rarest occurrences in human lives, indeed possesses an unequaled power of self-revelation and an unequaled clarity of vision for the disclosure of who, precisely because it is unconcerned to the point of total unworldliness with what the loved person may be, with his qualities and shortcomings, no less than with his achievements, failings, and transgressions. Love, by reason of its passion, destroys the in-between, which relates us to and separates us from others. Love, by its very nature, is unworldly, and it is for this reason, rather than its rarity, that it is not only apolitical, but anti-political, perhaps the most powerful of all anti-political human forms. This strikes me as an important point, both in Arendt's work in general, in which love is part of a private sphere, a non-public sphere, also a non-social sphere that is often ignored in Arendt's writing. We often talk about the political and the social, and we forget the importance of the private where we become who we are, where we are disclosed as a who. And it's this disclosure as a who that is the becoming of an individual. In love, there's different ways that we disclose ourselves as a who in the private world. One is through thinking, which is a solitary activity where we think, and in thinking develop our own ideas different from the conformism of society. It's where we become original. And in thinking is one way we become a who can then cross over the boundary between the private and the social, or the private and the public, and enter the world as an individual. But another way we become a who, she says, is through this power of self-revelation in love. But this love, she says, is without an in-between, destroys the in-between, which relates us to and separates us from others, and it's unworldly. Now, in a real love, where we love someone also who's in the world, and to go back to the passage I read from the Varnhagen book, someone with specific patterns in a specific world, we become a who that can then enter into the public world as a who. In a way, love can give us a kind of who-ness, substance. But Rahel's love for Finkelstein was not such a love, because it was this kind of fully unspecific love. It was love without any strong coherence. And this brings us to the chapter we're reading for today, which is called All Over, How Can One Go On Living? And it's the years 1799 to 1800 in her life. It's after the breakup with Finkelstein is complete. This breakup was, she says, a real blow. And the question is, how can someone like Rahel, who is a schlemiel and who, in a sense, turned introspection to rebel against and flee the oppressiveness of the world, and then found in love a who-ness that was empty? Well, when that breaks apart and she's left with nothing, it's all over. Even introspection now has no power, because whatever happened has broken up the fantasy, the introspective, thoughtful imagination of who she was. The question then is, how do we go on? What's left? This is and this is, and as you'll see as we get to the ends of the chapter, where we take up three romantic figures, Schleiermacher, Schlegel, and Humboldt. This is not just a problem for a Jewess in Berlin named Rahel Varnhagen. This is a problem for modern society. How do we in modern society, who have been subject to the feeling of meaninglessness and abandonment by the world, how do we go on? How can one go on living when it's all over? And that's the theme of this chapter. Where do we want to start then in this chapter? Let me just stop for a second, because I've actually talked for 10 minutes and I know it was a bit of a review. But let me ask if there are, before I move forward, because it's a short chapter, so we're going to get into it pretty quickly, and it goes quickly. This may be a good chance for us to let people ask questions or comment on the book and where we are so far. Are there questions or comments so far?
Roger, this is Suzanne.
Someone just said something, but you got to speak a little louder.
Okay, this better?
Yes.
Better? Okay, this is Suzanne. There was one sentence that jumped out at me. It's the second page of this chapter, and she writes, passion's insistence upon absoluteness caused her capacity for novelty to perish, its organ to atrophy. And that struck me as a kind of fatal diagnosis, given the importance of newness, new birth for Hannah Arendt. For her to say that about Rahel was to make a very big statement about where this woman had gotten to and what was possible after that. I mean, to not be able to create something new is such a strong charge. But I don't know if she returns to that later. or if that
Well,
just becomes a given.
I think that's an excellent point, and it is in many ways the theme of the chapter. So let's just make sure we understand the claim. The claim is at the beginning of that paragraph that Suzanne just read from, that Rahel had become a specific person, so a who, but she had not acquired any specific qualities. This is it's a strong diagnosis, and we can obviously contest it in some ways, but let's try and understand it. She falls in love with Finkenstein, and he's a count, she's a schlemiel, but he has to, in a sense, he has to lose his world, his aristocratic world, and so he becomes a nothing. What does he offer her? He's this man without qualities, to borrow a phrase. And so she, in loving him, it's simply she needs that love. The love gives her meaning, gives her a who-ness, but she doesn't enter a new society. She doesn't enter a world. It doesn't actually give her a worldliness. And so her reality, Arendt continues, it manifested itself only in what she had suffered in what was now past. So now she is broken up with him. Who she is simply someone who has been jilted or had been given love and then lost it. There was an inexorability about the past, which no future, no hope, no possibilities, no matter how deeply longed for, could outweigh. So it seemed like she was so overcome by the past. This is the all over. How can I go on living? Rahel had dared to yield to chance. She took a chance that she could marry her way or love her way out of her Jewish schlemiel-like state. Chance was mightier than she, its reality stronger than any calculable fulfillment of natural, necessary hope. What had happened to her was irrevocable, had happened to her forever. So she lost this risk. She took a risk, she lost. And what does it mean that it's forever? And this is the question Suzanne is asking, is it forever? And then the sentence Suzanne read, passion's insistence upon absoluteness causes her capacity for novelty to perish, its organ to atrophy. Where hope does not wait expectantly, it is difficult for anything unexpected to occur. And I think that's an important additional sentence to what Suzanne read. Where hope does not wait expectantly, it is difficult for anything unexpected to occur. As long as Rahel has no hope, as long as she wallows in this, it's all over, then I think, Suzanne, your fear is right. There's no capacity for newness, for novelty. But I think the rest of the chapter and the future of the book, which we're going to get to in the chapter 4, in which hope returns, is going to show that there is a way to return the passion for novelty, but we have to understand the sort of state without it as well. Her future would now be prolongation of the past. If the future were someday going to appear as the present, all it could do would be to repeat the past. This was the truest unhappiness, where she had arrived at a point when she could no longer wish to be happy by force. And so I guess what I'm trying to say, I hope it's somewhat sensible, is that on the one hand, you can live without hope. You can be without hope. And when you are, the past weighs on you as irrevocable. There seems to be no way to imagine an escape from it. And such a situation is the absolute unhappiness. And the question then becomes, how can one go on living? And we're going to see some examples of that in the Schleiermacher, Schlegel, and Humboldt sections. And then in the next chapters, we'll see examples of it with Rahel. Yeah, go ahead.
The sentence where she could no longer wish to be happy by force is very striking because it means that really it has very little to do with love. The whole relationship that she had before, she didn't actually, or at least in the chapter, Hannah Arendt doesn't show it as true passion. She basically shows it as perhaps a strategy for escaping Jewishness. But it's a very strange sentence because if we're in the depths of despair because of a collapsed love story, then it wouldn't be wishing to be happy by force, I think. So that's kind of strange to me.
I think you're right. I mean, the love with Finkenstein is not one that, well, it's one that Rahel willed herself to. It was not and yet it became love. I mean, she did fall in love with him, but it was not one based into anything specific. She longed to free herself from Judaism. And one way she sought to do that is to marry a count, and that was very much her attempt. So, but it was a forced, intentional escape. And I think you're asking is, well, is that love? I mean, is that what love is? And I think Arendt's answer is it is love. It's what is love? Love is as she says in The Human Condition, love possesses an unequaled power of self-revelation and an unequaled clarity of vision for the disclosure of who, precisely because it is unconcerned to the point of total unworldliness with what the loved person may be, with his qualities and shortcomings, no less than with his achievements, failings, and transgressions. Love, by reason of its passion, destroys the in-between. Love, by its very nature, is unworldly. So, maybe we take a moment to think about that claim, which I think, based on the question we just had, is one that's somewhat controversial. In love, we become a who, but it is unworldly. It doesn't actually depend. The lover, the loved, is loved not for her or his qualities or shortcomings, his achievements or her achievements, his failings or her failings, or her or his transgressions. Love becomes a bond that is unspecific, unworldly. I wonder, let's just take a moment to ask an experiential question. Maybe some of you have ever been in love. What do you think? Does that make sense to you?
What doesn't make sense to me is the sentence that Suzanne raised before. Passion's insistence upon absoluteness doesn't seem to conform to the idea of wishing to be happy by force. They seem to be incredibly contradictory. So I'm not sure what exactly she's saying. Is she saying that if love is not what we think it is, and it can be the desire to marry a count and become a refugee from Judaism or Jewishness, is that absolute passion? I'm very confused, obviously.
I don't think it's easy. I think these are two slightly different points. The passions insistent upon absoluteness is that both love and the failure of love in this case are absolute. Um, Love is absolute, and that in love, everything else falls away. You can love someone if they're a rich count, and you can love someone if they're poor and ugly. I mean, that's what she's saying, right? Love is this, well, it's being struck by Cupid, and there's not a whole lot of rationality to it. And it doesn't always conform to social or reasoned or other worldly norms. It happens, and it possesses us. And insofar as we're possessed by it, it's absolute. And when we are possessed by it, we actually have a capacity for novelty because it can make us appear and do things. But when it crushes us in its absence, the absoluteness can destroy who we are, make us feel completely alone and lost, and thus cause our capacity for being a who and for novelty to atrophy and perish. Does that help?
Not if she had intended, can you hear me?
Yes.
Not if she had intended, as she says here, to love the Count because of the fact that he was a Count, and not regardless of the fact that he was a Count. So it seems as though the entire passion for this Count was from the beginning, and as Hannah Arendt described it in the previous chapter, rather contrived. I don't quite see why she's so heartbroken about it, since she basically really didn't want it to happen.
I think it's important to understand that while she may have originally willed it to happen and contrived it, she did fall in love.
Yeah.
It wasn't simply contrived. You know, there was an original impulse which was maybe forced, but Cupid struck.
Yeah.
That's part of Arendt's point, is that, you know, love can happen, and when it does, it can be an absolute passion.
Yeah, I think that's a critical step, you know, that there is this initiation that comes from her thoughts, feelings around being Jewish, but then, yeah, Cupid's arrow, and she falls in love, and love becomes, it rescues one from thrownness. Suddenly, social conventions fall away, and one can get hold of a who. But then there's another step, Roger, because you said something about in that state of capturing one's who, or recognizing one's who, one can develop certain capacities, certain skills. I can't remember the exact word that you used, but something happens that then enables one to go back into the world in a different way, in a changed way. And that, I mean, I sort of took your experiential challenge, and that all makes sense to me. That there is this piece of being in love where it is all about who, and the in-between has vanished. But then what happens with that? And does what happen include this development of capacity, of skills that one can take back out into the world? And I guess for Rahel, that last step didn't happen. She got the who part, but the developing of skills part, to go back into the world, wasn't there. That makes sense?
Yes, I mean, it's important to remember that this chapter all over is an account of 1 year of Rahel's life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if you've ever had a love end, maybe you can some sense of what Rahel is experiencing and what Arendt is here trying to count for, which is the complete loss of a world. To the extent that love is unworldly, but that it, as you just said, Suzanne, allows for the revelation, the self-revelation in having somebody love you and you love them. And it discloses, when you're in love, you feel seen, you feel alive, you feel powerful. So much of Arendt's work, as you all know, is about appearing, to appear in public. What allows somebody to appear in public? Well, there's a lot of answers to that question. On a political level, you need laws. You need a space of appearance, as she calls it in The Human Condition. You need the laws, which are the hedge around the polis. You need the agora. You need the space where people can go and speak and act, and other people will listen. But you also need to be someone who has something to say, who feels empowered and is empowered to leave one's private house and go and say something in the agora. And there's different ways you can become such a person. One is through education, to be educated into being someone who is a public citizen and feels empowered to say something politically. You can be a genius, an artist, who withdraws from the public into the private sphere and in their solitude of thinking, rethinks things and comes up with new ideas of justice or of truth or of beauty. And through writing or sculpture or painting or music is empowered to put those ideas into the public realm. And another way is through love, in which you retreat from the world into this bond, this other unworldly, anti-political bond, which is perhaps, she says, the most powerful of all anti-political human forces. And yet, even though it's anti-political and it's unworldly, it gives you a sense of of power, of selfhood. And that power allows you to exit and enter the public world. So, yeah.
Roger, I wanted to go back to, in my book, it's on page 40. I'm still not at all convinced that Rahel was in love with him. I mean, to me, if you get rejected by someone, that's painful, even if you're not really in love with them. So, that could explain some of this. But where she says that I'm trying to be something and I will recognize you. You cannot take any pleasure in me. I overawe you, and therefore I too cannot find any happiness with you. So it seems to me that once he was in her circle and had to drop the trappings of his aristocratic life, she saw he wasn't anything. And so I'm not at all convinced that she was actually in love with him. So I'm surprised in a way that Arendt seems to be validating this relationship. It seemed that she wanted to escape. That was what drew her to him. Then she brought him into her world, and then he was divested of all the things that she had originally wanted. And so, she was unhappy it hadn't worked out, but I just don't really see this as a great love from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're reading from a period of the time when they're breaking up, and I think that's certainly by then it's failing. Um, but
Can I say something?
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think, we love, we don't really understand, we often don't understand why we love someone. And it's often very complicated. And I think that this idea of her sort of self-arranged prospective marriage, it was like an arranged marriage in a way that she was trying to make, it's not that uncommon. I mean, I think people still do it. And I think when someone said you can be really upset when someone rejects you, even if you don't love him or her, I think that's true. And I also think in this case, and often she thinks she screwed up. She was almost getting what she wanted, which was entry, into a society that was foreclosed to her. And she pushed him too hard, or she demanded too much, or she didn't play it right, and she lost it. She lost that opportunity. So it's hard to know whether or not she's she's upset and despairing because of that, or because she had come to love him and really, was feeling rejected and losing a great love. I mean, I tend to think it's more the former, but it's probably hard to sort out. And she's very melodramatic and romantic, which I think Hannah Arendt is too, in a way, around this description. So, I mean, to me, it's probably a bit of both, but I think it's probably more the loss of the opportunity than what we sometimes, in terms of romantic love, call love.
Is somebody sharing a screen? At me? Just happened. Oh, there we go. Yeah, thank you for that. Let's just take a look at the beginning of the section Through Love. It's in chapter 2, Into the World, part 2, where it says Through Love in the heading, and in that long first paragraph, we have a long letter. Rahel writes, and she describes this visit that he had come to see, and she says near the end of it, this first paragraph, I felt I knew that I had remained faithful to him, as he is, in spite of my knowledge of him. I would have remained faithful to him if he had permitted it, if he had wanted it. If yesterday, by twisting a magic ring, he had been able to abolish all that has taken place in these 12 years, he could once again have drawn my whole life to him if he had wanted to. And then Arendt's gloss on this is only a magic ring was needed, and everything could have started from the beginning again. What then was he who was nevertheless a nullity? Did she really mean this man when she said she had remained faithful to him as he was, in spite of her knowledge of him? Or was he merely accidental? So in the next paragraph she writes, so then she had loved him, he who was nothing. She who, as Veit had said, could find no object of love, and Finkenstein was not even merely the chance object that made her catch fire. She was in no wise seeking romantic love, which often is more than the object of it. Otherwise she could have calmly dropped him and still have had her love intact. But in fact she had let Finkenstein go at last, only after years of fighting for him in particular. Again, you guys can decide if you think she's right or wrong in her account. But she clearly thinks that Rahel loved him. Suzanne, are you trying to talk? Because I don't hear anything. You might have to unmute. Susan,
No,
are you
I'm
trying to talk?
sorry. No, no, no.
Oh, okay.
Roger, this is Jack calling. I think I'm trying to see if I can find a way to express this. This section that we just read takes place long after the next chapter. It's 1811, and there's this long period during which she languished with this memory, this thing that was in her past, that somehow could have been rekindled, is what's suggested. It could have been rekindled if he had reached out to her, but by this time he had changed in a way that made it totally impossible. And I think that that's what Arendt is talking about when she talks about the inexorability of the past. That once it has been lived, once the past, once you have, so once something is in the past, it no longer allows for the future that you imagined before it happened. Just there's no room for that.
I think that's exactly right. That's the claim she's making. And she's seeing, on the one hand, she's just talking about Rahel, right? And this is the hard part for me in trying to read this book, because clearly Arendt is offering a biography of a specific person, and yet this is a strange biography, as we've talked about and know. And it's also the case that Arendt clearly has in mind that this biography is not just a biography; it's an account of a phenomena that she thinks of as deeply modern, deeply foundational experience of the break of the old world, the world of traditions, of religion, in which we are all born into a world, and that world has authority, and that world has a claim on us, and we exist in a world, and very much the experience of the modern world for Arendt is an experience of a world in which we're born into it, and the world doesn't give us meaning. In fact, what we see in the world are the broken pillars of the old religions and customs and traditions that gave us meaning. And the question is, how do we respond? How do we go on? And so there's a tension here, as to the extent that we read this as a book about a specific young Jewish woman struggling with the fate of being Jewish, and the larger question of what does it mean to be a human being in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, as the old world is falling apart, and there's a increasing sense that life is meaningless. The rise of romanticism and existentialism, and a feeling of the rise of the novel, the turn to a literary experience, an artistic experience, that whereas most art up until this time had been about fate and the gods and religion and a common world, in which people were largely the playthings or the carrying out certain fates. Suddenly, with the novel, we have an introspective art form in which the inner life of a protagonist is what is at issue and what drives us forward. And there's no doubt that Arendt is trying to see Rahel, or thinks of Rahel, in light of this.
Roger?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Howard. I typed this in a kind of inarticulate way, but as this discussion has been developing today, my mind shifted away from human love, meaning a love of one human for another, into other forms of love. The love to create art, the love for philosophy, the love of kinds of human experience, at least to me, of love that are indeed passionate and everything that she's talking about. And it seems to me also that one of the things that's happening in our present world is that this type of love is being devalued. Unless it can translate into some kind of economic reality, it's being deemed worthless. And I see this in some movies that I see on Netflix. I see it in a lot of different places. And so, while I think it's important to talk about love between humans, I think that there's a way to expand this. And I think that your previous statement that you just made does that into other areas. That's it.
Yeah, thank you, Howard. I think that's a good point. Insofar as one, I talked earlier about there are different ways that we can become a who, disclose ourselves. One of them was through arts. We talked about, and I think in some way you're talking about art. You're talking about love of literature, love of philosophy. These are the withdrawal from the world of politics or the public world into an academy, into a ivory tower, if you will, and the embrace of a contemplation or thinking. And one of the constants of much of the last 2,500 years of human history is that the public world, while it is dominated by men of action, also included philosophers who wrote, artists who created, and clerics who thought religiously. And that these figures, although they were not rich and not powerful in the military sense, were part of the public world. To the extent that we now measure power by money, these individuals, these kinds of careers, these kinds of loves are increasingly disvalued, devalued, and seen as less meaningful. I think that's a fair and important point.
Can I say something?
Yeah, I also know there's a couple of questions, so you say something and then we might look at some of these questions.
Okay. Well, I'm still not convinced that Rahel had any real emotion here and therefore had a true pain. I think that Hannah Arendt's dealing or treatment of this is really not the same as, say, a psychological study of a human being in despair, but I think there's a lot of the political in it. If in my book on page 53, she says that Rahel's desire to fit into the world has been expressly rejected. She had known all along the world's hostility in general, and now she had proved it in particular. So in a sense, the rejection is sort of a trope for the fact that she could never really escape her Judaism. And I think Hannah Arendt isn't feeling an emotional grief or a passionate loss, but rather a statement on a political society, a social statement. That's how I can only read it. And I think that it's very important in the next paragraph. She says, disgraced by destiny, but no longer susceptible to disgrace, which means that this experience may not be forever changing Rahel, but for the moment, this is how she is. And now she has to find other defenses, other ways to deal with her Judaism. And it's interesting to me that we expect when we read a biography of somebody that the narrator, who would be Hannah Arendt, would be totally sympathetic an understanding of the psychological turmoil of Rachel, but I'm not feeling any proximity or closeness to Rachel at all. I feel quite distant from her. And I can see this sort of an analytical study. So if it's a personal treatment of her emotions, then it's sorely lacking in my estimation. If it's an analysis of her struggle to find a social place, respectability, defeat of her, alienation, then I understand what Hannah Arendt is doing. I may be totally misreading it, but that's what I think.
I think it's a fair point. It might be worthwhile to just remind ourselves of Arendt's statement of her method in the preface. It's the last page or the penultimate page of the preface, where she says, "It is inherent in the nature of the method I have selected that certain psychological observations which appear to thrust themselves forward are scarcely mentioned and not commented on at all. The modern reader will scarcely fail to observe at once that Rahel was neither beautiful nor attractive, that all the men with whom she had any kind of love relationship were considerably younger than she herself, that she possessed no talents, etc. She was typical of romantic personality, and that the woman problem, that is the discrepancy between what men expected of women in general and what women could give or wanted in their turn, was already established by the conditions of the era. I could touch upon such matters only insofar as they were absolutely essential to the facts of Rahel's biography, and could not consider them in any general way, since the point was not to assume to know more than Rahel herself knew, not to impose upon her a fictional destiny. That is to say, I have deliberately avoided that modern form of indiscretion in which the writer attempts to penetrate his subject's tricks and aspires to know more than the subject." And I don't know if that helps you or not, but she's trying to simply tell what she thinks Rahel thought, and not know better than Rahel. And she thinks Rahel thought she was in love. And many of you, as I've said, will be dissatisfied with that because we're moderns who seek to do a kind of false consciousness analysis. And Arendt says, I'm not going to go that route. I'm going to trust her. I think at some point we're going to have to ask the question of whether we think this is a legitimate method or not. I get the impression Daphne doesn't think so.
Not at all. I think it's just that it's an interesting I mean, I had Hannah Arendt's preface in mind when I said all that, because it is, in fact, very unpsychological. It's not a romance novel. We don't get the satisfaction of identifying with Rachel. But it brings me back to the question I asked in the first time we tackled this, is why did she find Rachel so fascinating? Which I still don't know the answer to, but anyway.
Well, that's a great one, and I think that on one level you have to think about the answer as the beginning and the end, which is this statement that the thing that was most embarrassing and the greatest, misfortune, that I was a Jew, turned out to be the greatest fortune. But what I've been trying to sort of frame today in this discussion is that I think the reason she found Rahel so fascinating is that Rahel responded to this incredible misfortune with what was one of the great examples of the modern arsenal to deal with abandonment and loneliness, which is thinking, the mania for thinking, self-introspection. And I think that Arendt finds this deeply meaningful. On the one hand, dangerous. On the other hand, one of the maybe the only, no, not the only, but one of the principal avenues available to people to address the problems of modernity, the challenges of modernity. I mean, the paragraph you just read, I think you said on page 53, it's on 42 in my book, is worth looking at just quickly. Those who harbor hopes and have some prospects for a next day can go on hoping that life will deny itself, that it may still show another face. So if you have hope, you have a hope that there will be change, novelty. Rahel no longer had any hope. Her love had been refused, her desire to fit into the world rejected, expressly rejected. She had known all along the world's hostility in general. Now she had proved it in particular. Now her inferiority, her lucklessness was confirmed. And this is the experience that she begins with. The next stage, right, which begins on the next page, is how maybe to move forward. And it begins in this paragraph on the next page. What had happened to her was more than merely the grief which she might perhaps have been able to cling to daily and hourly. Regularity is not so absurd as youth is inclined to believe. I would star that sentence. For a thinker like Arendt, for whom the world, worldliness, the common world, what holds us together, is so meaningful and important. Regularity is not so absurd as youth is inclined to believe. Regularity is part of what builds the common that holds us together, that gives us something to share. One of my favorite metaphors in Arendt's work is the metaphor of the table that she uses in The Human Condition. And what she says is a group of people sitting around a table, even if they disagree or talk about other things, are connected to each other by the table, which they all recognize as a table and know that they're with each other. But take the table away and they're just a bunch of isolated people without anything connecting them. The table is a form of regularity. It's a thing that connects us. She continues, regularity alone guards one against confusing the grief with the bad experience. It alleviates the pure and unqualified lament. So it's one thing to be overcome by grief. It's another thing to just say you have bad experience, which you can overcome. Life itself, by going on, by refusing to show any consideration for the person who claims that everything is over, thrusts the past further back into the past with every passing day, thrusts it back but does not obliterate it. So that's an amazing, this is, I think, very important for our understanding of Arendt in general. We need to be able to move on, embrace life even in its horrors, even in its grief, even in its bad experiences. And this is a big part of all of her work. So think about the origins of totalitarianism, which we've read. We have to understand totalitarianism. We have to understand it because it is a response to real needs in the modern age. Yes, we want to resist it, but we shouldn't resist it by simply pushing it away and saying it's bad and we're not going to think about it. We have to somehow understand it as part of who we are. We have to somehow reconcile ourselves that totalitarianism is not some foreign thing and that it won't disappear with Hitler and Stalin, but that it's actually an ever-present possibility today, and that even if we never have totalitarianism again, we might have things like it or even worse than it. We have to reconcile ourselves, she says on the next page in this book, to the fact that life continues on its course, though we may bear within us what we will. We have to reconcile ourselves to the burden of life and not seek to console ourselves, but actually to confront that burden. And if we do, as bad as life is, life itself provides certain regularities, certain commonness that allow us to rebuild a common world. And that's an important political point for Arendt. So that on the bottom of, well, on this page a little further down, it's probably 54 or 55, paragraph beginning, during those years, Rahel's attic room on Jägerstrasse received visitors from all the social circles of contemporary Berlin. Her unique gift became a kind of attraction, and her friendship with Prince Louis Ferdinand a kind of advertisement. At this time, she was still conscious of the chance offered her by her being a social outsider. For a brief moment, she was even proud of being a Jewess. He, Louis Ferdinand, is said not to have enjoyed any such acquaintance before. And then we have all these different kinds of people that she brought into her salon. Cultivated people, princes, mistresses, ministers, counts, Jewish doctors, singers, countesses who wore men's clothes, Humboldt, Schleiermacher. I mean, the point is that she could in some way find ways to embrace life, even as someone for whom life was over. And this raises the question. This is the question that Hannah Arendt now wants to ask at the end of this opening section of this chapter, which is right before the Schleiermacher section. How then could one go on living when everything was over? And then we have three examples of how we might answer that with Schleiermacher, Schlegel, and on Humboldt. Let me take some of these questions that have been building up. Some of these I think are probably, maybe we've already discussed. Jennifer says, being in love is otherworldly as you are in private world with the one you love. Is that, I think we've talked about that. Jennifer, do you want to add anything more?
No, I just wrote it in response to a question you had much earlier.
Okay.
I didn't interrupt verbally.
Okay, thank you. And Jack, I think we already answered or talked about your question, right? So Susan writes, to make the question more complex, my mind wanders to love beyond another human. Oh, this is a little bit like, this is Howard's question.
Roger, that's me. And I already asked the question. Okay.
Thank you. To Daphne's point, the book is chronological, and therefore, whether or not it is intended, is a tale of growth and development. I think that's right, although it does go back and forth, as I think Jack himself pointed out. Jenny Lynn writes, why the dichotomy between personal treatment of her emotions versus analysis of her struggle? I think that there may be an attempt here to treat emotions not as emotions, but as larger symbols and ideas. To analyze them as seriously as she would analyze a political or historical text. I think that's right. She's not doing a psychological reading of emotions. She's trying to say, Rahel felt this way, and this feeling is has importance in the world. She felt love, and she became a person, although one without specificity. And then she felt abandonment, and she became almost nothing. Okay? Jack writes, I cannot help feeling that the exposition of romanticism in this work and the sense of its relation to the modern is very specifically German. Well, that's true. I mean, so first of all, let's just recall Arendt is writing this in the mid-1930s in Germany under the direction of Karl Jaspers as a habilitation. She certainly has not yet encountered the American authors that have such an impact on her later, nor many of the others. This is still a young scholar, a young woman, a young person, at a time of great rising anti-Semitism in Germany, working with Karl Jaspers, who's, while he was a brilliant and very anti-Nazi, married to a Jewish woman, very pro-German in the sense of Germany as the seat of the Enlightenment and of great culture. And Arendt is still very much part of that German tradition. And the fact that she talks about Schleiermacher, Schlegel, and Humboldt, I think, gives that away. Jack writes, so we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Ah, yes. You want to say something about that, Jack? What do you?
Yeah, it was. It came to my mind when you were talking about, when we were discussing the relationship of the past to the future and the fate and so on and so forth, why one is caught in the past and how one escapes from the past. It is, I think, a pretty well-known quote, the very end of the Great Gatsby, and it's a description of trying to move forward but always receding into the past.
Yeah,
and I think that's that particular point of view that he expressed before she wrote this book is very Arendtian.
Well, I think it's a view that Arendt feels very much real in the modern age, an age in which we increasingly feel ourselves incapable of acting and making a difference in the world. In a world in which bureaucracy turns governments into unresponsive, many-tentacled, oppressive systems, in which, when we want to try and change something, we go to this agency or this body of government and we try and change it, and they say, no, it's not up to us, it's up to them, and then you got to go to them, and no one, you never know who's responsible, and this is her critique of bureaucracy, the rule of nobody, as she calls it. It's very much the experience of beating your boats against the current and being borne back ceaselessly into the past.
I wanted to say about, I really had intended, I don't know if I can actually articulate this, which is why I quoted Fitzgerald, but there is a sense in which we are looking at a book that tells a story of the past, right? This is a present day scholar looking at the early 19th century, and there is a sense in which her predicament, Hannah Arendt's predicament, is connected to that past, whether she likes it or not. And she even says so, right? Well, she doesn't say directly about herself, but what she says is that whatever your reality is inexorably connected to the past. And so I felt like this little quote really captured that sense that the past, not only is the past inescapable, but it is part of your struggle to move forward.
I think that's right. That's right. Howard writes that in our populist world, commonality is deeply fractured. Well, certainly our reality is deeply fractured. The populism is one aspect of that. I think it's always a question of, well, there's the question that's being asked a lot right now. Well, where is the center? Is there a center? Has the center disappeared? This is not the first time in the last 20, 30, 50, 100, 200 years that people have asked this question. This is a question that is deeply modern. And, one of Arendt's, in the book we just read last time, Thinking Without a Banister, second volume of Essays in Understanding, the one we read in the last session. We read a number of essays in which Arendt basically says the problems that we have are not going to be solved by policies or this or that. They're going to be solved by people confronting them as problems and talking about them. Not because one side is going to convince the other side, but because in talking with the people you disagree with and the different factions and the different sides, you talk to them and you begin to find, amidst your many differences, which are real, certain commonalities, a new center, a common things we do agree on. The challenge for Arendt, or that Arendt puts to us, is that if you want to create a common world or create something common, you're going to have to find what you might call the lowest common denominator of what holds us together, which means it may be that what holds us together is something much more profound and deeper than that we all agree on, take your pick, a wall or abortion or school prayer or gun violence, etc. And it may be that what we need is a system that nevertheless finds things we agree on that we can do together, whether it's preserving freedom or equality or creating a just education system or an environment that we can all be safe in and let people live differently within it. That's, I think, in many ways, one of the lessons of her political writing in the last decade of her life, last 15 years of her life. This embrace of an American plurality that allows for finding a weak commonness that allows for strong particularity and plurality in different places. One that's very popular on both, very unpopular right now, both on the left and the right, and that's a bit of what she, I think, comes to fight for. Suzanne writes, I think this text is psychological. Oh, so we're going the other way. Deeply psychological, but in a new way. I am reminded of Ricoeur's distinction between regressive. You're going to have to help me out, Suzanne, because this is beyond my reading. Regressive hermeneutics and a progressive hermeneutics. Ricoeur's critique of Freud is that Freud only practiced the former, regressive hermeneutics. I think a case could be made that Arendt is doing a progressive hermeneutics. I'm not sure if you want to try and explain that to us, because that's beyond my
Okay, I'll do this really quickly. Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, phenomenologist, wrote an important book about Freud, in which he presents this distinction between doing a regressive hermeneutics, a regressive way of understanding, versus a progressive way. A regressive hermeneutics, that is Freud, was all about looking to a person's past to find the determinants, the causal factors for behavior that one observes in the present. And for Ricoeur, as a phenomenologist especially, that seems to be a much too limited way to do psychology, a much too limited way to try to understand another person. So he proposes instead this progressive hermeneutics, where one begins with the person and how that person is seeing and experiencing the world, And as the person doing the analysis, you seek to understand where that life is headed. Not simply knowing where it was, but what are the directions for the future. And so you look for things like hope, you look for desire, you look for wishes, you look for intentions, for motivations. It's all pointing ahead. And for Ricoeur, that's a more legitimate way of understanding another life, to see where it's headed. And I had never put Paul Ricoeur and Hannah Arendt together before, although their books exist on my favorite authors shelf right next to each other. But I never thought there was a connection until we went back to the preface, where she's clearly saying she's not doing Freud. She's not doing this traditional psychoanalytic looking to the past for determinants, and instead starting with the person. And I thought, well, isn't that what Ricoeur was calling for? And I very quickly Googled her name and his name, and indeed, people have thought about them together. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you very much. I mean, Ricoeur and Arendt are seen by many people to have commonalities. They both are phenomenologists in some sense. Mm-hmm. It's just not, the regressive hermeneutics versus progressive is not something was going to be able to say anything about. So thank you. We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to just turn to the second part of the chapter, which is the discussion of Schleiermacher, Schlegel, and Humboldt, which is an attempt to answer this question of, given all what we've been talking about, how can we go on living when everything was over? And for Schleiermacher, she says that we have this kind of idea of a perfect life where we're fixed in perfection, but perhaps it is possible to oppose a different reality to life, which tramples over the person. And this, perhaps it's possible, is the Schleiermachian possibility of how one can go on. I want to focus on Schlegel because probably Schlegel's the most familiar to all of you. It's also the one that Arendt keeps coming back to and talks about in this book. So she writes about Schlegel in Magic. The Romantics attempted to intensify the world, and whatever life could bring to such a pitch of extraordinariness that reality would necessarily fail to come up to expectations. Magic arose out of the boundlessness of mood. Playing with possibilities engendered the romantic confusion. Then she says at the end, but since magic, after all, does not have any power over reality, the end of this paragraph, since magic cannot make the sweetheart die, it can only conjure up moods which would affect the lover if his sweetheart should die. This conjuring up of future moods, which convert all reality into the neutralized "it has already happened," has a peculiar effect upon reality. In the fantasized mood, direct affliction is anticipated. All possibilities, even the extremists, are translated into a future past in order to offset the present dread of them. This constant toying with possibilities becomes, in reference to the individual and his environment, a great source of confusion. Confusion overwhelms the possibilities, plays them off against one another, lets none dominate and none attain reality. It's this confusion that the romantic magic of different moods allows for, which allows us to, in a sense, escape the it's all over of life. Just to return to what she says about Schlegel back in chapter 1, she says that in Schlegel's Lucinde, all that we learn from the hero's life in the novel is couched in terms so general that only a mood, no real events, can be representative. Every situation is wrenched out of context. Life is without continuity, a mass of fragments without connection. Since each of these fragments is enormously intensified, life itself is shown as a fragment in the romantic sense, a small work of art entirely separated from the surrounding world. And this opens the possibility for introspection, which annihilates the existing situation by dissolving the world. If life itself is a work of art, then we can, in this romantic mood, think of reimagining life. And this is the Schlegel's answer. So on the next page, and still in the Schlegel section, she writes, Friedrich Schlegel had not been able to endure the process of aging, the continuance of life. Life had been unendurable, just like for Rahel, life became unendurable. He had been incapable of coping with time. His magic could only stand up to the deceptive reality of the moment. Schlegel possessed the same kind of personal magnetism which made Rahel famous during that period. She too, once she had become rigid, was able to play the part demanded by the moment. She could work her magic upon all who came to her. She was able to handle the miscellaneous personalities of her salon. She was in her element when she was able to play so upon her circle that each person said exactly what was most brilliant at the particular moment. Magic, she writes, has a power over people, but no power over time. It cannot command time to stand still. In romantic confusion, there lay a chance to permit reality to break in. Schlegel threw that chance away because he himself could endure his confusion only in the imagination, in the enchantment of a mood. He never really created confusion within himself, for he desired balance and ultimate harmony. So the claim here, if I'm getting it, is that in the face of this oppressiveness of life, the romantic response, the way to go on living, one of them at least, is to deny the specificity of what is oppressing you and attribute it to a mood. And if you can do that, you can imagine other moods, conjure up future moods in which you are in charge of, or where you have an identity, where you have an element, and you can work magic upon others who see you now as something else. It's another way to become an individual, a who in the world. And Schlegel, she thinks, fails at this. Rahel succeeded at it, insofar as during her salon period, she made people come to her and see her as she was, as this sort of magician of the salon leader. Humboldt, in this last few pages, she says, also succeeded at this in different ways. Even though he was empty inside and had no natural talents, a bit like Rahel, he experimented on himself and others in such a way that he was able to liberate himself from his emptiness and embrace life. So this is the romantic solution to the problem of the complete abandonment of the individual to life. Are there any we have about 5 minutes, so are there any questions or comments on this chapter? No?
Roger?
Yeah.
I felt like I needed an introductory sentence to these three little pieces that she gives us on these men. I found myself saying, wait a minute, why are we here now? Is it simply, that's not simply, is the point to show us these three different romantic alternatives? Is she telling us something about what was in the cultural air for Rahel? because earlier, in a couple of paragraphs above, she talks about how important it was for Rahel to have this man within her salon. So are all of these three figures somehow important others for Rahel that enable
I
her
mean,
to...
I think it's more that they are in the air,
Okay.
and there are three different figures who offer an answer at this moment to the problem that Rahel here is seen as a embodiment of.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions on these three figures or on the chapter as a whole? Let me ask a different question. I mean, are you guys finding this book? I mean, this is a different book than our normal reading. Are you finding this book gripping, or maybe someone could say what they're liking or disliking about the book? It's hard for me to know because it's so different from a lot of what we often read Arendt for. It's hard for me to know exactly how much people are finding it compelling or so. I mean, I think the conversations are great, so maybe we are. I'm just interested to hear what you're liking or not liking about it compared to our more usual Arendt.
I think that the book is deceptively complicated, and I'm never quite sure what I'm supposed to understand. I know that with some of her other books, the philosophical aspects of it were very dense and complex, and it took a long time to read. But here, it should be simpler, and yet it isn't. But I am enjoying it, so if that answers your question. I'm just angry that it's hard to read.
Uh-huh. That makes sense.
So, Roger,
yeah.
For me, this book operates on so many different levels that just the reading of it is I don't want to call it an excitement, but there's a kind of a freshness because this is the telling of a life, and something I've been very interested in for many, many years. How do you tell a life? And this is a very unique way to do it. It has the characteristic of being an exposition about dealing with being Jewish. It has the characteristic of exposing, exposing in the sense of unfolding the ideas of the Romantic era in a very personal way, so that Romanticism becomes personalized. So we have these three figures, for example. Why do we have these three figures? Because everything is contained within personality, and it's something it's a point of view, I think, that Arendt is putting forward, but not stating it. That in the way in which she tells this story, that everything is in the personality. There's so many things going on in this book, even though I confess that it's obvious to me that it's translated from the German, and there is an aspect of the language itself, the way it's structured. One accepts this when she writes in English the same way, right? I don't think that she's being mistranslated, but there is something really very, and that's I mentioned it earlier, something very, very Germanic, both about the content of the book and also its style.
I think that's true. Let's see. Kim, you want to say something? Because you have a dissenting view. Seems.
Can you hear me?
Kim writes, I don't find it as compelling as Arendt's other works. I prefer her other writings. You want to say something about that, Kim, or not?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Not really. I just prefer her, I guess, other more philosophical or political works. This is a book that I tried to read many years ago and just wasn't all that interested in. I wanted to move on to her other works that I hadn't read. So I'm not as engaged with this book. There are definitely, of course, it's interesting, and I really have enjoyed the conversation today, and it has great relevance to some things that are happening in our world as far as alienation and isolation. But I just don't find it as compelling.
It's funny. When we decided, there was a movement to read this book a couple months ago. I remember when that happened, and I was a little worried, I have to admit, because it's not a book I've been totally engaged with. I've been surprised by how engaging I've found it. And I'm hoping to convey that to you guys. In fact, I have found myself in the last few days writing about this book in a book I'm writing on totalitarianism, because I find her discussion of introspection so compelling as the forerunner, but also a way of thinking about the questions of loneliness and abandonment and alienation, which are so crucial to her books, Origins of Totalitarianism and in The Human Condition on World Alienation. But if you think about so much of her book, The Human Condition, which is about world alienation and earth alienation, and the way in which in the modern age we are alienated from a common world, and the common world is destroyed, and there's a question of what does it mean to be human left with us. This book is in many ways a kind of background to that, in a way that I had never seen before reading it this time. And so, on the one hand, Kim, I get what you're saying. I asked this question because I figured there'd be people who feel that way. But I've been surprised and pleasantly surprised at what I can find in it. But I'll do my best to keep trying to bring that aspect of it out as we keep reading forward.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Like I say, on the alienation and isolation aspect of it, I think probably for me it's the context that I struggle with. It's not that I'm not enjoying it.
Oh, I didn't say you were. I'm just.
Yeah. No.
Look, I think it's an important question because it is so different, and yet you can see some of the beginnings of what comes later in there. And
Yes.
by the way, the last chapters are new, right? They're written in the 1950s, and so I think they'll be much more engaged with some of the questions that you're interested that we think of as Arendtian questions, especially chapter 12 and 13.
Okay, thank you, Roger.
Yeah. Listen, thank you all. We'll meet again in 2 weeks, and I hope you continue to enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much. Bye all.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you,
guys.
Roger.